Let us weave a tale of fantasy, beauty, and art. Behold what lays in store for you in today's adventure on the YouTubes. So what I want to do is to limit the color palette in the scene. And I'm going to limit it to red and blue, because those are the two color elements where my focus goes as an audience. And I kind of dig it, but it's a little too purple for my taste. So I'm going to come back into the dialogue, come to shadows, and I'm going to decrease the blue just a little bit and take us back toward red, and then output all of this to a new layer here in the layer stack that's set to a blending mode of screen. So if we actually look at just this layer of what Oniric did, again, you can kind of get an idea of what it's targeting within the image. Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm David Bird with Reality Reimagined. My artistic passion and the main genre that I work in is fantasy composite artwork. Creating this art involves many steps, and the two that I love the most are photographing the images of fantasy and cosplay characters and then bringing that story to life in Adobe Photoshop. I've had the fortune to be able to collaborate with other photographers and step into the artistic process mid-journey. Taking their image and creating a piece of artwork in Photoshop, independent of the original vision, is an exciting adventure. Today's tutorial will be an exercise of this rare aspect of my fantasy artwork. I'll be creating a piece in Photoshop using the image of another photographer with no knowledge of what their vision was when they created this concept. Let's take a look at the overview in today's tutorial. We'll have a brief discussion about what's been done to the image already and the design choices we'll be making in the two major parts of this tutorial. First, we'll be color grading the image to place it into a fantasy world, and then explore using Oniric by Composite Nation to put the final ethereal touch onto this art. Please reference the time color code below to move through the tutorial at your own pace. Before we begin the journey today, I'm seeking your help to reach my first goal with this channel on YouTube, which is to gain 1,000 subscribers. If you like the content that you find today, please give the video a like, share it with others, and consider subscribing to the channel. New content debuts each week in photography and Photoshop education, and when you subscribe, make sure to click the bell to be notified of that new content when you return to YouTube. Thank you so much for your support, and now, in the immortal words of Gandalf the Grey, Frodo, let us begin the journey, Frodo. Climb the mountain of Photoshop, Frodo, and take the one Wacom pen and throw it into the fiery chasm from which it came, using frequency I have no idea what I'm doing. This is the image that we're going to be creating the fantasy artwork with. This image was captured by Maureen, and this is her daughter, Breezy. You can see both of their work by following the Instagram account links at the bottom of the screen. So, of course, story-wise, what I see is a young woman who is lost in a daydream, thinking of other worlds, other places, other adventures to go on, and there's a sad look in her eyes as she looks off into the distance. But I don't see any elements within this that suggests any kind of fantasy world. So in essence, this could be a picture of a princess from a period in Earth's history in the past, and we're just catching that moment in time now here. But I wanted to take it into that realm of fantasy. I wanted to give it one of those elements. And, you know, if she had elf ears on, or she was holding a crystal ball, or you know, something along those lines, then maybe that would immediately suggest that sense of fantasy storytelling. But I want to create it using something very simple, which is the image itself. So when I look at this picture, the first thing that I am drawn to is Breezy's amazing eyes. And that's the goal of any photographer when you're photographing somebody, right? You want the audience to look at their face. And I look at her eyes, and Maureen and I have already talked about this, that her eyes are very captivating. And hopefully Maureen and Breezy and I will get the chance to be able to work together in the future at a future conference later this year. But when I look at her eyes, that crystal blue and all the wonderful colors that are inside of it, I see that, and then I see her red lip color. Of course, the dress, the hair, we're seeing a lot of whites. The tulle and crinoline is white. The wig is white. The peach colored dress in that family of reds. And then we have the green in the background that takes up, you know, the rough top third of this image. So what I want to do is to limit the color palette in the scene. And I'm going to limit it to red and blue, because those are the two color elements where my focus goes. As an audience member, when I look at this image, I go straight to her face. And the two strong colors that I see in that zone within the image is the crystal blue of her eyes and the red lip color. So I'm going to use red everywhere else in the image. I'm going to keep the white, creamy colors that we have. The peach color of the dress is in that red family, so I think for now it's safe to stay in that color space. But I'm going to take the greens that we see in the grassy area here. I'm going to take the greens that we see in the dress and so forth and blend them all into red. And when we do that, visually from a color palette, we're going to have a simple color palette to look at, which makes us really then just want to connect with Breezy's eyes. But more importantly, when all of this grass and so forth is turned red, it instantaneously creates a sense of fantasy. This isn't a normal world. This isn't something that she would be laying down in. So when we see the wig that's indicative of Game of Thrones, we see the beautiful dress, the long lost look in her face, and then that red field in the background, and that red is tied to the rest of elements of red within the image, it becomes that fantasy concept, or at least that's the goal of what we're going to try to create. So what's been done to this image already? It's been resized. The original image was a little bit more zoomed out. There weren't any other major elements within the image, but I essentially cropped us in so that Breezy's face would be in the center third, or the bullseye right in the center of the image. From a perspective of rule of thirds, I'm trying to drive the audience's focus directly to her and create that pleasing overall flow of composition with the rule of thirds of having her into the center itself. Then it's been retouched using frequency separation, dodging and burning, and some actions to enhance the eyes. All of this was done by hand in Photoshop. Simply going through, cleaning up skin texture, using the mixer brush and the basic brush to paint colors into the scene, dodging and burning, sculpting as a global dodge and burn, and then enhancing the eyes. If you were interested in learning how to do that process and frequency separation is unfamiliar to you, then please look at the video series above on this channel. It's a retouching series that takes you through the basics of frequency separation, its many different uses, dodging and burning, and beyond. It's an ongoing series and it's beginner friendly, so check those videos out if you want to learn more about frequency separation. So knowing what's been done to the image, we're now going to enter into the first major part of the tutorial, which is to color grade all of this. And what I want to do first is to color grade her. So I'm going to simply duplicate this layer by hitting Control or Command and the letter J. And then I'm going to take the layer into Adobe Camera Raw and use it as a filter to remove the orange tones within her skin and then paint that back into this scene. So I'm going to hit Control Shift and A, or Command Shift and A if you're on a Mac. That will take you into Adobe Camera Raw. And then I'm going to come to my favorite tab in Adobe Camera Raw, which is the Hue, Saturation, and Luminance tabs. And the reason why I love this tab is because it gives you access to the color orange. Every human being, regardless of your ethnicity, you have orange in your skin tone. And with this one slider, in these three different tabs in Adobe Camera Raw, I can change the hue of orange, the saturation, and the overall brightness of it. You can do the same thing in Photoshop using hue, saturation, adjustment layers, and some other elements. However, it's difficult to kind of target the color orange. You can do it with those things, but you have to mess with range and so forth, and it's just much easier to come into Adobe Camera Raw itself. So what I want to do first and foremost is come to the saturation tab, and I have two options of fading out the orange that's in her skin tone. I can simply grab the slider and I can pull it all the way to the left, and we can immediately see the overall effect. But while you're here, I do want to point out that there is a tool in Photoshop here in Adobe Camera Raw called the Targeted Adjustment tool. When I click it in certain tabs within Adobe Camera Raw, it will do basic functions. So if I click somewhere on the image and I wonder, is this orange, is this yellow, is this red, I can click, and as I drag it to the left, you'll see that the orange slider is beginning to move, and so is the red slider. The yellow slider is staying right at 0. So we know that right now the two predominant colors in this area is predominantly orange, but the red slider is coming down just a little bit. So using the targeted adjustment tool is a great way to help you really focus on what colors you're adjusting within this tab of hue, saturation, and luminance, and like I said, other tabs and other sliders and controls in Adobe Camera Raw itself. So I'm going to go ahead and bring the orange slider back down just a smidge, and we're going to give her a little bit of that neutral alabaster skin. Now the goal is I don't want her to look like a vampire, and I don't want her to look dead. So I'm not going to take it down too far. I'm going to bring it back up just a little bit, but that slight hint of removal of that tone is really going to play into this ethereal beauty within the image, and again let those other colors come into play. So I'm going to slide it back just a little bit. I want to get just a little bit more warmth back into it. I can move the yellow sliders back and forth, and as you can see, that's affecting the grass up top. Just as a side note, a little side tip, a little nugget for you here today. Most grass is not actually the color green, it's yellow. It's just a hue of yellow that is grass. So when you're retouching grass, don't try to move the green slider because very little is going to happen. So you can use green to saturate the grass a little bit more and give it different shifts between blue and, yeah, I made my point. So I'm going to not worry about the yellows here. I will bring the reds down just a tad because my intent is to use the layer mask with this layer to fade it back in to the base layer itself. I just needed a new palette essentially to work with. Now I can come to luminance and I can bring the luminance of orange down, which is going to dull all of this down. I don't want to do that. I want to make it brighter. I want this white glowing ethereal feeling, and the ethereal glow is going to be the next part when we step into Oniric, but I can help Oniric out already by getting us to a place here where I can create some of that. So I can push the orange luminescence up just a little bit, and same with the red luminescence, and I think that looks good. I'm going to come to the basic tab while I'm in this view, and I'm going to increase the black point just a little bit in the image, just to give it a little bit more tone. And I will also increase the contrast just a little bit as well to give it just a little hint more, increase the shadows, because I want some good separation between the existing luminosity values of shadow and highlight, so that when we do add the effect in Oniric, it's going to look pretty slick. I'm going to bring the highlights down just a tad, which is going to give it the overall effect of not being as bright, but the highlights are more in that top luminosity data where they're going to potentially get overexposed and crushed in Oniric. So if I bring it down just a little bit, we'll have a good play within there. So I'm going to hit OK. And now that that's been processed, we can see, if we zoom in just a little bit, a before and after. It's a subtle change in the tones, but that subtle key change when we only have two strong colors within the image, which is red and blue, should really help us out. So I'm going to put a black mask onto this, or a hide all mask, by holding the Alt or Option key and then clicking the layer mask icon at the bottom of the layer window. And this way I can just simply paint it in where I want it to be within the scene. I'm going to be painting with a brush that is at a flow of 100% and opacity of 100%, and just simply start painting it into the areas away from her lips, away from her eyes, and just a little bit fading it up into her cheekbones. There's a little bit of natural red and from the makeup that she was wearing onto her cheekbones, and I want to try to preserve some of that if possible. And I think that should be pretty good right through there. And we'll touch this a little bit down there. We'll come and just give the face one more little bit of a pass. There we go. Okay, and I think she looks pretty good. We again have removed just a little hint of that yellow, and everything looks pretty fine. Now we're going to start using some adjustment layers to change the yellows and greens within the image to red. We're also going to be changing some other elements that we will see within the image to those colors. But this is where you can start to really, when you explore with these adjustments and do some kind of photography or Photoshop work like this, you'll start to find that there are many subtle colors within the image that you didn't see before. So something that is good to do before you tackle this, because we're going to be using a color balance adjustment layer, a selective color adjustment layer, potentially a hue saturation layer where we'll colorize the whole thing. You need to see the colors that are there, because it's difficult just to see it right now within the scene. So I'm going to make a hue saturation adjustment layer above these two elements that we just created, and I'm simply going to increase the saturation to a point that is stupid. And when we look at it, look at all the colors that you really didn't see before. And the key one that's interesting is the color blue. The color blue that's over here within this white dress, within her white wig, and these little fake flowers and so forth. These are colors that are in the image. They're just incredibly oversaturated. So if we bring it back to 0 and we're looking at it, you don't at first glance see all of the blue that's in the white dress here or in the wig or these little flowers. But as you begin to increase it, it becomes visible and you can see that. So as we begin to work shifting all the colors within this scene toward red and so forth, it's good for you to know what you're working against. So in this case, I'm going to bring this, I'm just going to go ahead and delete this hue saturation adjustment. We don't need it right now. Let's go ahead and do the selective color adjustment. And the first thing that I want to come down to is the yellows and the greens. And we're going to start shifting them and playing with them to get these colors where we want them to be. So simply introducing and removing all the cyan from this yellow channel, essentially within the image, this yellow color, and we start shifting and increasing the magenta. We're turning all of that grass into that red family and increasing all of that. Let's go ahead and let's push this more. Taking the yellows away is going to give us a little bit more of the blue value back into it, which will again control all of this. And just very briefly, the selective color adjustment layer gives you access to every single color, but you can shift its values between cyan, magenta, yellow, and RGB, red, green, and blue. So I can take all of the yellows and start introducing a balance between cyan, magenta, and yellow, and red, green, and blue to make the yellows within the image be a new color. This is a wonderful tool to give you very selective control over each color and what you want to push into it. So let's go to the greens and just see if there's any in there that we can play with. And yes, those are in the dress. So if we take the cyan down, we increase the magenta, and we add some more blue to it, we're getting into that realm already. Let's go ahead and go to the blue channel, because remember, we saw a lot of blue in the image by using the hue saturation adjustment layer. So I'm going to go ahead and start shifting these around, introducing more red into it. Let's push this back a little bit that way, and we're going to increase the yellow. I obviously don't want to add more blue to the blue within the channel, but it's the magenta yellow one. I don't want to necessarily give it too much magenta right now. If anything, I want it to be more neutral. So we may have to use a hue saturation adjustment layer and just reduce the saturation of this section of the white dress, and then just paint it in that regard. So I think that looks pretty good. Let's go to the cyans and see if there's any cyan in the image that we can bring down. There is a little bit, obviously, in that blue area there. With the black slider, I can essentially increase the black point, which makes things darker, or I can increase it by making it white within that individual slider. So here I can start shifting it a little bit this way and that, looking at those tones. I think we'll be better if we just, because we're not getting enough red into the cyans to have it show up where I can see where it's affecting the image. So I think we'll be better there if we just do a hue saturation colorize layer and affect it in that regard. So in this point, I think right now we're pretty good with the selective color adjustment. So let's go ahead and go into color balance. And color balance is going to, again, give you the ability to deal with cyan, magenta, and yellow. CMYK, K is the Kelvin point, and then RGB. But this is looking at it from a perspective of light values. So within color balance, you have the option between highlights, shadows, and midtones. It's looking at the luminosity data within the image, and you're actually adding colors and shifting them based upon that parameter of highlight, shadow, and midtone. With the selective color adjustment layer that we just used, you're taking one individual color and adjusting the color ratios between cyan, magenta, yellow, and RGB within that one color, if that makes sense. So I know there can be a lot to throw at you at once if you're new to Photoshop, but trust me, it will become more clear to you as you work with those. Selective color adjustment layer gives you control over one color and how the colors play in it. A color balance layer gives you control of how you can infuse color based upon the light data within the image itself. So let's go ahead and go to the highlights, because there's a lot of strong highlights within the image. Midtones is where it will definitely show up the most, but let's start with highlights and work our way down. So I'm going to increase the highlights and start shifting it toward a little bit of red, and we can see that effect take place everywhere within the image. Let's go ahead and increase the magenta just a tad, and let's go ahead and give a little bit more blue. Now, right now, as I make these sliders and I move them around, I'm ignoring Breezy's face. I know her skin's going all over the place, and I'm ignoring most of the white that we see through here. I'm looking at all this red up here. This is my first goal for this color grade, is to turn this area into this interesting red color so that we can create that fantasy world, so to speak. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good through there. Now let's go to the midtones. Again, the midtones, we're going to be able to see a lot come into play. And let's shift it. Ooh, I kind of like that. If we introduce a little bit more cyan into the midtones. Rather than having it be a very vibrant red, it's getting us more toward that magenta purple that I personally like. So shadows, we can give it just a touch there. That's helping us get some more of those purple feelings into it. And then when we really increase the magenta, yeah, that's pretty slick. And let me close this down just so you can take a look. Keep in mind, again, if you are new to Photoshop, if you consider yourself a beginner and looking at this, adjustment layers are gateways to tell Photoshop what to do with your image beneath it. And just with these two, and it's very simple, I encourage you to experiment with them. With these two, we have produced a very interesting overall look to this image. I want to paint it into certain areas and use that design philosophy that we talked about at the beginning of the tutorial. But I encourage you, use the adjustment layers that you find in this window. When I teach at conferences, I teach all the time and tell people you have to learn why things work in Photoshop. If you do, you can begin to create your own styles, your own visions. So these two basic adjustment layers of color balance and selective color, knowing how they work, why they work, we've created this really interesting, really cool look. So I'm going to go ahead and when you use an adjustment layer that come with a layer mask, I'm going to invert them by hitting Control or Command and the letter I for invert. And that's going to turn the masks black so that I can paint white onto them to begin to reveal the overall effect of where I want it to be. And I'm going to go ahead, it may seem counterproductive because you can say, well, you don't want it on her skin, you know that, so leave the masks white and just paint black on them to take it away. But I want to carefully start adding this in, so I need that level of control. I'm going to change the flow of my brush to 10% by hitting Shift and the number 1 on the keyboard, and I'm simply just going to start painting this in. I'm using a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet that has pressure sensitivity, so the lighter that I interact the pen with the tablet, the lighter the tool is going to interact with Photoshop. I highly recommend that you use a pen tablet. There is a learning curve with pen tablets. I'm fully aware of that. When I got my pen tablet for the first time, I put away my traditional mouse in a drawer for 2 months and forced myself to use just the pen to navigate not only Photoshop, but to navigate things like browsers, internet browsers, and so forth, and programs on the computer. Pens and pen tablets will give you tremendous control over your artwork in Photoshop. I highly recommend them. Okay, so we've painted some of that into areas where I can see all of that green and so forth. Now I'm going to come to the color balance layer and start up top and introduce this color, because since I said that this is the area that I'm thinking about first with this overall effect, I want to see it just isolated here and just see how it comes into the overall image and comes into play. And I kind of dig it, but it's a little too purple for my taste. So I'm going to come back into the dialog, come to shadows, and I'm going to decrease the blue just a little bit and take us back toward red. Yeah, let's go ahead and just go. Again, we're in the shadow luminosity values and we're increasing the red. And I think that's better than going into that more purple region. So I love that flow. I'm going to hit B for brush, and then I'm going to hit Shift 0 and 2 to change the flow of my brush to 2%, because I want to just very carefully start painting this in up top now and feathering this in over the dress, because the dress is a little bit translucent. It's probably made of tulle or crinoline or whatever, so that you can see through it. And so we can potentially see through to some of the green that is beneath that was in the original photo itself. Just like in areas through here, I want to increase and just paint them through so we get a little hint of that. Now I'm painting along the outer perimeter edge of the dress. I'm going to take it away from this section right through here. And I changed the flow back to 100% because I wanted to make sure it was the color balance layer that was the culprit, and it was. So now I'm painting white again at a flow of 3%, very minimal, and just feathering that into that perimeter edge up there. And, you know, whether that plays into the actual realism of how the color cast would have occurred if she was laying in a field of red in our fantasy world, I don't know. But this is a design choice where I'm driving focus of the audience. I want the audience to not catch a little hint of green up top and be like, I think he might have done some photoshopping to this photo. So anyway, I think we've establish our point there, and I'm going to just now fade it in a little bit. Now I don't like how that's coming into play right through there, So I think we'll be better served with using a hue saturation adjustment layer to reduce the overall color shifts that we see everywhere else. So I'm going to put a hue saturation adjustment layer up top, and I'm going to bring the saturation down. Okay. And then I'm going to bring the lightness down. No, right about there. Okay. And then I'm going to invert the mask, so it's a hide all mask, and start painting it into the scene. And again, I want to do this very minimally. I'm going to change the flow of my brush to 10% and just start painting white onto this to reveal that desaturation in areas where I just don't want to see other existing colors too much. Removing some of the color casts that can be in the whites. And again, as we use that initial hue saturation adjustment layer up top, just to see what colors were in the scene, we can see what we're dealing with and what's coming into play. I'm going to come back to the color balance layer. I really don't like how much fringing we did up top of that color. I prefer, I think, to go ahead and use the hue saturation adjustment layer that's desaturating that edge. I'd rather do that instead of trying to turn it that pink, because I feel like it's just a little too obvious of what we did through there. Okay, feathering that out just a tad more. Good. Now I'm going to make another hue saturation adjustment layer, and this one's going to be a target focused one for just any other areas, like specifically this thing right here, whatever that flower was. There's a little too much yellow and orange, and it's going to pull focus, in my opinion, because when we limit the color palette to just a couple of basic colors, we have to be very cognizant of what's on the screen and what can potentially come into play. So I'm going to just slide this over and start, again, shifting this toward an area that's in the red families that we're okay with. And let's shift it a little bit more that way. And I'm only looking at that little flower or whatever it is, and I'm going to bring the saturation down. Yeah, I think I'm going to be a little bit more simple than this. I'm going to delete this, and instead of playing with a bunch of colors and so forth, I'm just simply going to come to our base layer, and I'm going to hit S for the clone stamp tool, and I'm just going to stamp it out because it doesn't need to be there. And I don't need to shift a bunch of colors around and sit here and mess around with that part of it and waste everybody's time. So we're just going to shift that out, or clone stamp that out, and I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so we've shifted the different colors. We've got everything into a place where I think it all works. There's some luminosity values within the image that I would ultimately like to address before I finalize this image, but that's going to be a process of using curves and using levels and so forth, and it's going to be really fine-tuned work that can take some considerable amount of time. So at this point, I think we've got a good base. You've seen the overall color shifts that we have created. And once we finish up the artistic process of adding more details, adding more contrast and so forth, a lot of more of those elements are going to tie together. I do want to make one more hue saturation adjustment layer up top and talk about the Colorize option here. This is what I was referencing earlier, where essentially I'm just going to turn the entire image to one color, and I'll be able to shift it and control it to get it into an area where I can simply use this to paint in. So I could have painted it into this element that was down here that we just clone stamped away, but ultimately I don't think it was necessary. So I'm just going to start fading in just a little hints of color here and there in some of the spots where we have some open gaps. And then I'm going to zoom in, and in these areas where we have fringing, where this was cyan or something else and it just wasn't coming into play very well, I'm simply just going to paint in very low flow along those perimeters, because they're a neutral gray right now, which doesn't look that pleasing. But if we just use that hue saturation layer that was changed to Colorize and start painting in just a little bit of a hints of color, if you will. Let me close the properties tab so that we can see it. This is a great way to just add in fake little elements of color into the image, and again, not spend forever trying to figure out which of the colors were the culprits in your scene, because they have been removed from a level of gray, and ultimately now we're cleaning those up. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the rest of the image along the perimeter where we did the effects through here on the dress, and just police it in any other areas to use this hue saturation adjustment layer on Colorize to introduce those colors to the scene. So sit back and relax, and I'll be right back with you. Okay, we're back. We went through the entire process of changing all the existing colors within the image to limit the color palette so that we're dealing with red and the crystal blue of her eyes themselves. Let's take a quick look at the before and after of where we were. This is where we were. and now here where we are. And I again love doing something like this because it gives me the ability to take an image of a story and a character and an idea that Maureen and Breezy have created, and then just tell another simple story with the artwork itself. And by changing all of those colors to red and then her beautiful eyes, I think this is going to be an interesting piece. So now I'm ready to take it into Oniric and move on to the second element of today's tutorial. So what I want to do is to make a composite layer of everything that we have active in this document. So at the top most layer in the layer stack, I'm going to now, with that layer selected, I'm going to hit Control, Alt, Shift, and E, or Command, Alt, Shift, and the letter E for everything. And that will make one composite layer of all the active effects. Then I'm going to right click this layer and come up to Duplicate Layer and then put it to its own new document so that we can work on it by itself with our living document here of all these adjustment layers. So as we're working, if something goes wrong, we don't like the look, Oniric is doing too much, we have the ability to go back and to alter these different adjustment layers. Once we moved on through a certain slate of histories, we may not be able to go back to this point. Or if we flattened it and worked destructively, we would not be able to make changes. So by putting a composite layer into its own document, we can simply now work specifically here and go back to our original one if needs be. So I'm going to click Generate for Oniric, and that's going to take it into the program itself. As I've said in other tutorials on the channel covering Oniric, Oniric does a lot under the hood. It's a powerful program, but it can take a little bit of time to get everything set and ready for you because it is going to do quite a bit inside of the program itself. So this, I'm going to hit Control Command and the minus key to zoom out just a little bit. We're dealing with the bloom in Oniric, which is simply the glow that it's going to be creating in the scene. And already at this level of threshold, it's creating a beautiful look. All of the white points are giving us that glow. Oniric looks for light and it looks for the white point within the image to begin to do the effect. So I can hit X-ray here on the Oniric plugin, and you can see anything in green is essentially the luminosity mask of what Oniric sees to run the entire effect. If I increase the threshold here, we're at 0.25, let's take it up to 0.5 and let go. It's going to re-render everything. It's going to see quite a bit more. Now, if I uncheck on X-ray, we can see the effect that it's creating. So essentially it was allowed to pick up more, but the more that it picks up, the more intense it's making everything. We have a couple of different sliders that can control this. Right now exposure is set to 0, but intensity is set to 100. If we bring intensity down to 50 and let Oniric rerun, now we're letting more of that ethereal glow focus everywhere else. We can increase the overall radius too, which should expand out the blur of the glow, which tends to minimize it a little bit. And I think that's going to be the goal for today's piece, because the more that we increase the radius of this, the more the entire image is taking on that soft, beautiful glow and a ethereal feel. I'm going to go ahead and increase the intensity back just a little bit, and let's experiment. This is the first time I'm actually running this image through Oniric, so I don't try to pre-plan all of this before I do it and test everything before I make the video, so that you're getting to see a real world aspect of what I go through as I try to create the artwork. I'm going to bring it back to 50. I thought, let's go to 60. 70 was too much. Yeah, I like that. And I think if we increase some of the overall shadows and contrast of the image, we'll bring back some of the black point within the image and ultimately be able to really target focus some of this. So I think that's okay. I like that look. I'm going to experiment. I'm going to hit Colorize, which will add a overall color to the entire glow. And so of course it's filling the entire scene with that color. If we shift it over here to the purple, red, magenta family, and then let's decrease the saturation. And it's not the overall saturation of the image, just the saturation of that colorize option that we just hit. No, I don't like that, because again, it's filling the entire scene with that. I like more of this white, beautiful sense of ethereal glow that we can see within the image itself. So there's one final thing I want to point out before we hit apply and go back into Photoshop. You do have the option in Oniric to use a layer mask. You can click this button and simply paint it in. So we could be very meticulous and we could go through and start painting in on the mask so that Oniric will only run on those areas of the threshold that it saw. We could paint it in on the little flower petals, on the wig, in soft areas on her skin and so forth within the dress, so we could really target focus what glows. And I think that's worth exploring, but it is going to take some time to do. So ultimately, for this tutorial, I wanted you to see the process of Oniric and what's going to happen. So I'm now going to click apply. It's going to take a moment or two to run all of this because, again, under the hood, it's doing a lot with this. And depending upon the speed of your computer, it can go a little bit faster. Sometimes it can go a little bit slower. So bear with the program as it processes. As you can see, again, it's rendering quite a bit. And once it's finished, it will take us back into Photoshop and then output all of this to a new layer here in the layer stack that's set to a blending mode of screen. So if we actually look at just this layer of what Oniric did, again, you can kind of get an idea of what it's targeting within the image to make it brighter, to give it that sense of glow and that sense of ethereal nature to it. So again, let's go ahead and finish up some of these elements, but I do want to get us to a point where we'll do a quick time lapse or a quick cut and we'll come back because I am going to explore using the mask in Oniric to just paint it in certain areas and see what we can create. But what I was saying is if I make a composite layer now of everything, so the effect of Oniric as well as the base layer into one layer by hitting Control Alt Shift and E or Command Alt Shift and E if you're on a Mac, I can now go back into Adobe Camera Raw and use it as a filter as we did earlier in the tutorial. So I'm going to hit Control Shift and A or Command Shift and A, and it'll take us in. Then I'm going to increase the black point in the image and see how we're starting to get that separation immediately. We can increase the contrast just a little bit and the dehaze as well, because the dehaze is meant to remove haze in the image, which as a byproduct is removing some of the effect of Oniric, so to speak. And we'll pull that in and instantaneously now you can see we get that beautiful separation. We see those original tones, this world that's created up top, and we get to see all of those bright, beautiful luminescence separations within the image itself. And that's just a simple pass of Oniric. So I love Oniric. I love the process and what it creates. And again, with a fantasy artwork like this, it can give you quite a lot. So now I'm going to go ahead and delete both of those and go, you know what, I'll make a new layer and I'm going to take it back into Oniric and I'm going to work with the mask to really target selected. So sit back and relax and we'll be back in just a jump cut here where I'll have the new output from Oniric and you can see what I target focused and we'll make a decision together. Which one do we think looks the best? Okay, we're back and spoilers, I kind of like the second version a little bit more than this one. So let me explain what happens with Oniric when you use the mask. And I've said this in the other tutorials. Essentially, it's a quick mask. So you see the image, and as you start painting your brush onto the mask, you'll begin to see the color red. So I just changed my brush to a flow of 5%, and I painted the entire image with red at 5% so that Oniric would take effect on the entire image. And then I changed the flow to like 15% and just started building it up in certain key areas, weaving it through to let it flow like almost like the ether of magic. I used it also to dodge her essentially in areas where I would dodge, like the left side of her cheek, her nose ridge, her chest, her lips, her eyes, and then the areas in the background itself. So building it up and controlling how Oniric can come into play gives it a more focused effect. So let's look at both. This is the original one that we did where this is the general pass and we have all of that brightened hazy glow. We had to control with intensity and so forth. And this is the one that I just did. I like this one so much more because it is so controlled. It's soft focused of light and glow in certain key areas and elements within the image that really stands out more so than having just that general wash of it. So it's something that really is up to the artist and intensity, and you can, yes, use both of them and they both come through to a certain degree. And there's nothing wrong with that hazy, dreamy feel that the first pass did. It's just so bright in certain areas that I feel like we're losing something of the overall artwork. So ultimately, this was the decision that I made to go with that second pass. And now the image would be ready to go into final artistic enhancement, where I would increase some of the saturation of luminance, both in the shadows and in the midtones, adding texture, sharpening it, potentially adding a few more colors and elements to the scene as needs be. So that completes this tutorial. Let's finish up with some final thoughts and talk about what we did today. So first and foremost, I want to say that collaborating with other artists is a blast. It's a lot of fun to do. You learn so much about yourself and the world of art by collaborating. But I do want to stress that communication is key, because you can take people's work in a completely different direction, and that may be what they want, and that's fine, but make sure you communicate and set those expectations. I'm pretty sure that Maureen and Breezy knew that I was not going to like totally screw up their photo and take it into some creepy, bizarre realm. So I appreciate that trust that they had in me. But when you do collaborate with other artists, make sure you communicate with them and set those expectations. Adjustment layers. They're the basic tools of Photoshop. If you're new to Photoshop, I strongly encourage you to learn why things work in Photoshop and experiment with those adjustment layers. We saw by using 2 of them, we can change so many colors within the image, and by that design choice, we were able to create the genre of fantasy within this image and augment it at least. So understand those adjustment layers and start using them in your photos. There's so much you can do when you do it subtly and build it up. And then of course, using Oniric, it creates that beautiful glow and effect to the image. I love the program. It's wonderful. You can find it by going to compositenation.com. There is a link below in the description below. Check it out. There's an update that's coming soon that will affect the mask system within it. It's just wonderful. I can't say enough good things about it itself. So the image is now ready for artistic enhancement. And if that's something you're interested in seeing, let me know in the comments below. If you want to see the final artistic enhancement of what I would do to this specific image, let me know and I will make a video and put it into the pipeline as soon as possible, showing you how to add sharpness to the image and further color grading and luminosity grading and so forth, and doing all of that work. If you like the content you find today, please give the video a like. Consider subscribing to the channel. There's ongoing series like the retouching series, further education in photography and Photoshop that's planned, shenanigans like the shop vlog and so forth. I appreciate your support so much and for watching this video today. So that concludes our journey for today, and until next time, I will see you out there in the world of Photoshop.